because it is exciting. This morning, we put into place for the first time Scholars of Color Faculty Forum, and I'm happy to announce that this is the first session that is sponsored by the forum. So you are part of history. Thank you for being here. No pressure.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. My name is Shakelia Finley. I am a PhD student at the University of Missouri, and this is Dr. Christopher Busey, an assistant professor at Texas State University. And this morning we're going to be discussing CUFA and 40 years of race research. This is a critical race discourse analysis of CUFA programming. So before we get into our research, we want to discuss a little bit about the source of why we started to look at these different issues, particularly through the lens of critical discourse analysis. About 2 or 3 years ago, NCSS sent, well, not NCSS, one of the groups within NCSS sent out a bulletin slightly before Halloween, and the person who sent it out used the word spectacular. And I believe that caused a whole firestorm of conversations about the source of the word, the racial history of the word, and how as a field we should be watching the way that we discuss these different things. And this led to the person who sent it out later issuing an apology. So Chris and I were having a conversation because it seemed almost inconsequential to us that this would still be an issue of the language of race and someone sending this out. And I will also add to this, on the campus of University of Missouri, right before Halloween, someone sent out a spooktacular newsletter. and I forwarded it to Chris, and I was like, this is still a conversation that is relevant in 2015. People understanding how language is used towards racialized groups. And sometimes words, people not understanding either the harm that can be done or either people from the outside looking in assigning perhaps venom or violence to certain words. And we wanted to kind of explore that a little bit. So that led us to this research endeavor of the purposes of this. The first one purpose of this research is to research and investigation was to trace the evolution of the race discourse in CUFA programs over 4 decades. Those research questions specifically are, what is the frequency of race and race-related discourse present within CUFA programs from 1974 to 2013? Secondly, what discursive practices have been used to construct race discourse in CUFA programs from 1974 to 2013? And finally, what trends in race discourse are present in CUFA programs from 1974 to 2013? And Chris will talk a little bit more about that.
So the conceptual framework that we use to approach this tedious research, it took a long time, as you can imagine, 40 years of CUFA programming. We use critical discourse analysis along with critical race theory in education. I do want to differentiate between critical race theory and critical race theory in education because there is some language that is different among those tenets. Using critical discourse analysis, we sought to examine how discourse leads to the social construction and ideology formation in discourse communities. We argue that CUFA represents a discourse community. We send a particular message with our program. NCSS sends a particular message with their programs. These do not just act as functions with dates and times and locations on them that provide attendees with a place to be. We send a message with the language that we use. Furthermore, using critical discourse analysis, we attempt to unmask the coded language and color mute practice that can often occur. So let's say, for example, and we see this often, the word urban, minority, multicultural. Well, who is urban? When I was teaching in Northeastern Ohio, I had a student from a rural community use urban. She was describing black students, but it's become a coded term. So critical discourse analysis is a means or an attempt to sort of unmask that coded language. Finally, we wanted to accentuate how whiteness has been normalized in social studies over the course of 40 years, which sort of plays into critical race theory in education. How is it that whiteness can be normalized in a society in which race and racism are endemic? We also proposed this research as a challenge to dominant ideology in social studies education. The ongoing and concurring discourse on democratic citizenship, it's important that we interrogate and trouble these notions of democratic citizenship. We express a commitment to social justice through this research and our experiences as scholars of color. It's really important that we understand not just the history of our field, but our current positionality in the field as scholars of color as well. So in conducting the research, the first thing that we did in using the critical discourse analysis framework, and this comes from Jones. Jones argues that whenever we engage in discourse, we engage in discourse in two different ways. We use involvement language, which is very direct, we get to the point, and sometimes we use independent language, which divorces us from the actual conversation that we're having. So Shakili and I, we created a list of terms, and this list was fluid. It was ongoing as we encountered new words throughout the programs. We would discuss it with one another and add them to the list. But our involvement discursive practices are those words, again, that are much more direct. Race, racism, black, African American, Latino or Latina, indigenous, Asian, Asian American, Korean, and we also, in having this list be fluid, added names because some names started to appear. There were researchers who were doing work on like Carter G. Woodson, for example, and that was added as involvement language as well. Independent language are those words, phrases, or linguistic devices that we use, again, to divorce ourselves from the conversation. So let's take, for example, multicultural or multiculturalism. There are a lot of different constructs that fall within or under that umbrella that need to be addressed. Same with social justice, diversity, culture, minorities. The criteria that we used in first extracting the presentations from this large amount of documents, we look for titles and abstracts that use the race words that we mentioned here. We included presentations that were specific to race and racism from an American context. And what's really important is that we counted symposia, paper sessions, panels, workshops, lunch sessions, and special sessions in our analysis. We excluded keynote speeches because we wanted our analysis to be specific to social studies scholars and what social studies scholars were saying. Our stages of data analysis. So first thing we did was we pretty much did a general frequency count. How many words were used from our involvement language framework along with our independent language framework. And then after extracting those presentations and putting them into a separate matrix, we identified and then coded emerging themes. I'm going to leave this up here for about 2 minutes just for you all to view because there's a lot of numbers. So in total, we counted 2,830 presentations. Out of those 2,830 presentations, 171 presentations were about race from our first analysis using involvement language. When you factor in our second analysis, which incorporates those terms or linguistic devices that use independent language, the number jumps to 322 total presentations, almost doubling the percentage to make a total of 11% of presentations over the course of 40 years presented in CUFA. Now we wanted to be somewhat creative in naming our themes that emerged from the presentations that we extracted. In total, we were able to finalize 3 themes. Our first theme, lost in translation. Second theme, to race or not to race. And our third theme, when we are there. I'm going to explain these themes a little further. So matters of race and racism in CUFA were masked in color mute and colorblind discursive practices. Words like multicultural and multiculturalism were often used to refer to race, but race words were never explicitly used. Let's take, for example, the word multiculturalism, which really did not emerge until the 1990s. Decade 1, which was 1974 to 1983, had 1 mention of multiculturalism in their programs. Decade 2 had 13 mentions of multiculturalism. Decade 3, which were mainly the 90s, the term multicultural or multiculturalism appeared 40 times in the programs. Also provided some sample titles without names, because that's not what our intention was in doing this research. But as you can see, titles like Experiencing Cultural Diversity, Community Service Learning Within Multicultural Teacher Education, or Knowledge and Intelligence, Roots of and Routes to Empowerment of Culturally Diverse Students. So who are the culturally diverse students that we are referring to? Our second theme, to race or not to race, and this is where our critical race theory framework came in, primarily with the construct of interest convergence. So let's look at the late 1990s. I believe it's a perfect example of how scant race has been addressed in CUFA programs. 1997, there were 2 presentations on race from our first analysis. In 1998, we jumped to 8 presentations from our first analysis. And this is with the conference theme being race, culture, and national chauvinism. Now, there were also a multitude of other things happening in CUFA at the time. 1999, as we can see, due to some of the events that occurred with certain scholars leaving the field due to a lack of racial address, we see now we're back to 4 presentations, and then in 2000, back down to 2 presentations. In addition to the scant representation of race and racism in CUFA, we also kept track of when race presentations were put into the conference programs. We kept track of time and dates. Many of the race presentations were scheduled either for the early morning sessions, which we know as conference attendees. Sometimes we're getting coffee and bagels. Or late afternoon session, when we're really tired and we go out for our adult beverages. It was also common for race presentations to conflict in time, as is this one with a race presentation that is currently ongoing right now. And I do want to say if we do end early, I would like for us to go there and hear what those scholars have to say as well. So let's say, for example, 1994. Gloria Ladson-Billings was a discussant on a presentation, or on a symposium rather, in which James Banks, Cherry Banks, Valerie Payne, Geneva Gay, and Christine Bennett were presenting. The title was Research Issues in Multicultural Education, Implications for Social Studies Education. At the very same time, Ciola Ross Baber, Lynn Boyle Bays, Carlos Diaz, and Jesus Garcia, with Hosea being the discussant, were also leading a symposium on teaching multicultural social studies in teacher education courses. I think it would be valuable for conference attendees to be able to attend both. The last theme that we were able to extract from our analysis, and we titled this When We Are There. And we have one person in the audience who is here, who's on this list. And Paulette Dilworth. But I wanted to name these people because I think it is important. So when you look at a large majority of race presentations in CUFA, they were coming from a certain set of scholars. Valerie Payne, Gloria Ladson-Billings, James Banks, Cherry Banks, Ciola Ross Baber, Geneva Gay, Tyrone Howard, Cynthia Tyson, Paulette Dilworth, who is in the audience with us today. What was really evident was that when those scholars were not there, you saw substantial dips in the frequency of race presentations and CUFA programs. Surprisingly, or I shouldn't say surprisingly rather, but what you also began to see in 2009, after a major dip in the amount of race presentations, was an uptick beginning in 2009. So let's take, for example, we had 10, 15, 12, and then 2013, a total of 27 presentations on race that were completed by scholars of color, or what I call as race allies. What's also important to note about the race allies is if you look at the origins of their doctoral programs, they were studying underneath scholars of color, or you can trace them back to scholars of color like Ladson-Billings at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we conclude with our discussions and implications, and I call this the curious case of race. Any of you ever seen the movie The Curious Case of Benjamin Button? So he's born physically pretty terrible looking individual, right? But his physical maturity and his intellectual and cognitive development, they're backwards. And the movie reminded me of CUFA. How is it that since the existence of our field, we're just now in our adolescent phase, or when it comes to race and racism? And moving forward, we argue that it's important for researchers to, number one, consider intersectionality, and not just intersectionality of research agendas with other issues of subordination, but also with certain constructs present within social studies education, like who is doing work on race in elementary social studies education, for example. There's a need for race and LGBTQ research, and I just put there generally race in your research agenda. Diversifying the profession, as you can see, is really key to the viability of race and racism in this field. Scholars of color, again, have been influential in ensuring that race discourse was present within CUFA and social studies in general. With there being a growth in race research, we also argue that, especially with white scholars, or the scholars who are not scholars of color, to consider the idea of interest convergence. So one thing that LeGarrette and I always talk about is that we have some people who do race research because they think it's a gap. And it feels like, oh, I can maybe get some things published because it's on race, but it's not really what I do. This is something that our scholars need to be aware of. In addition to gentrifying, race research and social studies education. The last point that we have there is sustainability, and I left that as a question mark, because what we're seeing now is something different. We're seeing somewhat of a movement, as evidenced by this morning's first meeting of the Scholars of Color. But what are we going to do to sustain the momentum? To end our presentation, we want to engage you all in discussion surrounding race and racism and social studies education and the sustainability of it. How can we keep this momentum going? This was an actual presentation from the year 1994, word for word. The title was A Retrospective on the Social Studies. The year is 2015. The year is 2015, and CSS is holding its annual conference and assessing the progress of the field by discussing the following questions. What have we accomplished? What have we failed to accomplish? What do we need to do? The chair discussing on that was Anna Ochoa. The presenters, Michael Wilma Longstreet, Charlotte Anderson, Frederick Risinger, John Hodge. Again, this was 1994, the NCSS 74th Annual Conference, 10:45 to 12:15, Holiday Inn. Yeah, we've come a long way. Navajo Beach. So what I would like to do, given that we were given an entire hour and 15 minutes for this presentation, and my job talk wasn't even that long, I do want to engage us all in discussion about these questions. So if we could spend some time at our tables discussing the two questions from a framework of race and racism. What have we accomplished in CUFA with regards to race and racism? What have we failed to accomplish? And what do we need to do to ensure sustainability and momentum of this conversation? If we could spend about 10 minutes discussing in our tables, and then we'll have sort of an informal discussion about this.
anti-immigrant. You're saying that some essential they had trouble getting right across to racists, but rather to the people who were should be the element.
Kind of the same thing. It's not that racist.
Don't consider it important. I think there's a lot of
Catherine and I just come to her and I don't think, I don't think it seems like the last couple of years we're starting to have concurrent issues that are social issues. Last year's general session, but has there been other actors that you all too?
well, the activism used to be very associated with yeah, and that really put a lot of people off because they had there wasn't enough space.
It's a hard, it's a struggle, like, part of what you guys decide that you want out to go to the problem. A lot of still
I love being so.
Yeah, no replicable references. I don't know if there were.
Yeah, I found my freshman foundation class, I found that they.
Do you all need a little more time to Elizabeth, sorry.
Go to yours, sorry.
If anyone, has any notes they want to take on these issues too, then feel free.
Call themselves out and call each other out on. That's what I But each other, to ask each other. And I find stepping out and facilitating with a question, and then instead of being like, you have to tell me the answer, tell each other the answer.
No, it's. I find ways to outside of the process to make my own especially if you want to have far more you know, in the border on racist, they're subtle or explicit, but it's just a constant total inability to even feel explicit. I'm talking about politics, like people that definitely don't consider themselves racist, and just a total like just not recognizing the issues that we have. And I think that's far more prevalent. And original, oh yeah, absolutely. Higher ed, college faculty, we don't think white privilege is the real thing and all these other things. They think that affirmative action scale toward people of color in our society is ridiculous. I'm talking about education faculty.
they are known. They're just like, not.
So I guess the question is, talk to.
Yeah, right. So you're saying we should do some.
Still just our, even if we don't make it, not but that shouldn't be in my burden to do that work, because I was blessed with this representative. So then the question is, how do we place all scholars to encourage you to investigate and to areas in schools? Right, so so that, and then you know, as a teacher with 25 white.
Would you call that the gentrified?
There is no, I mean, maybe I'll have a lot of people will she's an amazing worker. And she's so we have one person in Islam as a most with that kind of what is that? She does secondary psychology. That's important.
I agree with my staff.
You're so right. All the time, I don't know motivation. In terms of that, study stuff. I mean, I'm drawing on, but it's. But it's the closest
Black
Okay, if we could have everyone kind of draw back in what we would like to do, because I see some great conversations going on and we want to get in on those. So what I would like to do is just go from table to table and have each table share a little bit about the conversations that you were having surrounding answering these questions. And we'll start here and then move in the room.
So, we had a lot of, I would say, great retrospective about things that happened in from the state. There's a wealth of knowledge here. But the big takeaway, I would say this, an observation was made that seems when scholars of color leave the organization, so goes the research, right? So then the expectation still is, if you're a scholar of color, you're doing that research. And when we sort of came to, at the end was, we stopped doing that, right? We're happy when there's scholars of color that are here, but there's other kinds of research that scholars of color can and must do. And we also must encourage scholars who are not white scholars who are doing the work, encourage them. I mean, they are just as legitimate and can be just as legitimate. So those people, those folks who are doing the work, encourage it. And if we are scholars of color, encourage our grad students, regardless of what they look like, to engage in that work if it's their interest. So that's the big takeaway, that would be boost.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think one of the things that we talked about was that there's so few faculty of color to recruit students of color that we really need our white allies to work really hard to actively recruit graduate students of color, right? And that, even if the field of expertise isn't on race, that there's methods in social studies and so that there's other ways that you can contribute to the professional development of that student, even though race is not your area of expertise. So I think that's one way that we need to start working together, because we do not have enough faculty of color to recruit the students of color that we need.
And we also were just discussing on one of your previous slides how I said race in elementary social studies and how it's really needed because elementary in general usually get maybe 2, maybe 3 sessions total. And then just to even talk about race within elementary social studies education and the need for more people to actually take up that work because it's really missing.
I think we're also, I never taught in a traditional K-12 classroom. My background was in curriculum education and juvenile justice. Prior to starting the PE program at Michigan State, after really working in African American studies and the leadership there, rolled the dice on me and allowed me to teach a social studies methodology course because I did have the disciplinary background knowledge to meaningfully contribute to the field. And I think that we're going to have to rethink the way in which we define social education, teacher education, to begin to include some of these voices, especially when we know that there are so many systemic practices in place that have removed people of color from the teaching profession and kept them out of the teaching profession. So things that seem like we're trying to protect our professional identity and build expertise, like the 3-year stipulation for admission to some PhD programs and for admission and for eligibility for certain positions, right? We might have to rethink that if we want to challenge the systemic racism that has excluded us from the profession, because you might have people who are going to contribute so meaningfully to the discussion who haven't had that experience,
Right.
But it doesn't undermine their credibility or expertise in any way.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We talked about a lot of things. One question that we had was we thought it would be interesting, just talking about the research first, to look at proposals submitted in comparison to proposals accepted and what kinds of things are coming up there. So we thought that was an interesting idea. We were also talking, because we're all kind of newer scholars, about how we think that there's potential for kind of a rupture with emerging scholars in terms of confronting white fragility, because we definitely can see tension, but also see, like at the graduate roundtables yesterday, some really awesome conversations grunting positionality and stance. So we think there's potential, as emerging scholars to kind of create this new culture. So I'm not sure what that would look like, but
I also think one of the other things we talked about too is the idea that I wonder, what I was sort of thinking about is, are we kind of hitting another point? And I know there's this new thing, we're hitting more material and work, but are we also at is this rupture a place where people are going to leave it? I mean, if it, because what I'm hearing, like I was thinking at the grad panel yesterday, there's a lot of conflict between the newer emerging generation scholars and older generation scholars. And if the younger generation scholars isn't heard, and their work isn't acknowledged, and they have to continue to fight to be heard and acknowledged, will they just say it's not worth it and find another place, another space, which is perfectly valid. So if Kufa wants to be relevant, how do they keep that door open?
I'll say this. I think this morning, Shaquille and I were talking about it on our way to get coffee after the Scholars of Color Faculty Forum. Like what that meant to me, like the first time I ever came to Kufa, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Like I honestly couldn't believe it. I saw Garrett and Jamie, and we were all top students at that time, and that was it. That's all I could recall. And JB mentioned our dinner at Sweetie Pie's in St. Louis 2 years ago, which was an informal space, but even that was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe what's happening right now. And then this morning, to have an official space, like we have bylaws, like that's a big deal. And being critical of Kufa in this past, I also think it's important to recognize the progress that's being made. I know JD was saying that it was an overwhelming vote. No one said no to the Scholars of Color faculty forum. This, to me, they're showing hints of progress, and we can only hope that it's not interest purpose and that it's genuine, it's real.
I think I'm the old man in the room. What I've seen over the almost 25 years that I've been coming to Kufa is that scholars of color will come in, but after a few years they leave, either because they're pushed out or because they see better opportunities somewhere else. And in either of those cases, though, I think it comes down to they don't see Kufa as good at home. And so, right now there are quite a few young scholars of color in Kufa, but what I want to know is how do we make this a place where they want to stay instead of just being another leaver who, and then we come back and have the same conversation.
Right.
And I think that's something important I see is that that was kind of like the tension I had because I started coming as a high school teacher and then it felt like an unwelcoming space. So there were a few years where I did not attend because it did not seem to be a home where people were encouraging the ideas that I had or were wanting to partner with me to kind of create some of the spaces that I felt like was much needed. And it was actually when Dr. Johnson from Purdue reached out to me to become involved in a particular community in NCSS that and I shared with her then, well, I haven't been going because I just don't see where it's a good space for me. But when I came back and became involved in the community, I kind of adopted this be the change you want to see type of belief about this. And so I committed to attending every year. I committed to encouraging other teachers and colleagues to attending every year, and then have gone past that to also start building bridges between Kufa and NCSS so that there is a welcome home for scholars of color. And I think that one of the problems is that someone will get discouraged and leave, but they may not challenge themselves to step in, lean in, and try to see what type of space can be created. And it's extremely difficult work, but I want to encourage every person to do that work because it is extremely beneficial. My scholarship is places that it could not have been, quite honestly, if I had not built the connections that I have built here in Kufa over these last 3 years that I've become, involved again. And I want young scholars to see the potential for how they can be reaffirmed in this space, how they can be encouraged in this space, and also how they can increase the credibility of their scholarship through affiliation, with these spaces. So that's my spiel about that. Having personally gone through kind of like that space where I was just like, this is not for me, and then coming back and making it for me, which is a challenge that I want scholars of color and allies to do, is to make this a space for yourself. Don't just leave disgruntled, but tell somebody, this isn't working for me. I'm upset about the fact that there's a session I would like to be in right now, but I'm here and this is important too. So who do I talk to about that to say, okay, next year, quit doing that. Don't do that again. Because I want to support these other scholars and other people do too. And that can happen because that's logistics. We can address logistics. That's not the fundamental sky's gonna fall. That's something simple. We need to do that.
And I was just gonna say, Shaquille, kind of going back on what Jason said, being a first year doctoral student, and attending the forum this morning, I felt the support, I felt welcome. So in meeting new doctoral students, or even students who've been in the discipline for a while with scholars, I can let them know the support is there. I've spoken with Ashley about getting involved with the committee because I see the support there, and talking to Chris, so just letting others know that the support is there. They welcome your ideas, and I really feel great about it. And I'm like, okay, I'm ready. I want to get involved. What can I do? How can I be involved?
Thank you. And I want to thank JD because I can't sing his praises enough. As an advocate, as an ally, as a mentor, he is the truth. Because I'm telling you, there will be days and there have been days when I have said, you know what, my certification is still good. I will go back to the classroom, and conversations with him specifically about making this a space that can be an affirming, beneficial space has made all the difference in the world. So even through this research, even through these affiliations, I just want to ultimately encourage all of us to find someone in this space that you can look to. Ashley, talk to me off the ledge on a frequent basis. Those things will happen because the reality is that there are some people who don't want to see research like this move forward, and that is something that we have to embrace because this is a special session. Keep that in mind. A space was made for this. We don't know that this would have been something someone would have said, oh yeah, Katika Cooper, come on, do that at a regular session. So we appreciate greatly the space being made for this critical work, and also having the willingness to have a conversation about how we move forward from here, because we don't want to critique for the purposes of critique. We want to bring this to light so that we can not only interrogate these things, but move us forward so that this becomes an even more beneficial space for our scholarship. Questions, comments, concerns, feedback? Ashley?
I've actually written a song for Jamie, which I'll perform.
Okay.
No, I think there is something that has to be said for cost sharing as well. And this is not to undermine the work that Anthony and Najabi and others have done to embrace and to bring me into this space, right? But there's a toll to working to make a space your own. And I said, I would not be here despite, the encouragement of many scholars of color, right? If it weren't for, he's a Wolverine, right? Robert Bailey Umich. encouraging me to Wolverine, they can't be good people in American systems. Encouraging me to come into this space and to navigate this space and taking the risk to approach me after a conference session and say, like, I saw that you were angry, but in your anger, your voice was lost. And I responded to him by saying, well, if you knew I was mad, why didn't you try to speak to like what was going on in that space that was making me angry? And that was such a productive conversation, right? And I think it's going to, well, sometimes when we think of scholars of color, we forget that we are also scholars. And there are things that we can learn from senior scholars from all backgrounds and navigating the revise and resubmit process. But there are reasons I call Anthony, and now there are reasons that I call Bob, right? Having mentors from various spaces, like a network of mentors to encourage and promote, who are sensitive to these concerns, but maybe the titles of their work or their abstracts or even their research interests don't really overlap with mine, will also contribute greatly to my development as a scholar and as a critical scholar. So I think as we continue to re-envision this, we need people who have forms of recognized privilege to share that privilege and to be the ones willing to say these two sessions took place at the same time, right? And that was a problem for me as a white male scholar, right? And it's not always on our shoulders to be the voice of that, because I do think people get desensitized to the same people saying the same things over and over, right? Or I went and saw this great presentation, and I am concerned, not on behalf of anyone, I am concerned for my field and for the work that I do, because my research can advance unless other people are working to describe the world from their perspective, right?
Right.
So I would like to see more cost sharing integrated into the steps we take moving forward.
Thank you. All right. So that's our time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If anyone has any other feedback, our contact information is there. Thank you.
What are you doing for dinner? What are you leaving? Okay. I'll be here
Oh, you got it? Something good. It's just,
It is already done, submitted.
It is like 95%.
Carol divided up our responsibility. She went to a different message.
I'm not, especially our little model, I'm not even sure if this works, and we kind of have to, so we don't know this, but I think eventually
This is one of those things like
Sometimes that last bit, they aren't there. And they go,
One of your other questions, this research is not, why didn't you just do a control experiment?
I think it's like, I really think
I'd be like, when did these research do? Where you have students with those issues,